He was sold to a king to pay debt, married without love, punished for wanting, claimed for an heir. But when the king almost lost him, power turned into obsession, cruelty into fear, and Abbot Omega became the only thing the crown could not live without. Manual. Chapter 1. Sold and Claimed. Seorian knew he had been sold the moment his father wouldn't meet his eyes. The palace gates towered above him, ironclad and merciless, their shadows swallowing the stone path beneath his feet. Gold banners fluttered overhead, symbols of victory, conquest, ownership. His father stood beside him, hands clenched, breath uneven. "Do not embarrass me," he whispered. "Remember what you owe this family." Seorian said nothing. He had already been paid for. The doors opened. King Taeyeon stepped into view, and the world narrowed. He was not beautiful. He was overwhelming. Power clung to him like a second skin, his dark gaze sharp enough to flay eyes from bone. Soldiers flanked him, but he needed none of them. His eyes locked onto Seorian. Did not move, did not soften. "You're smaller than I expected," the king said. Seorian bowed deeply. "I exist to serve the crown." Taeyeon descended the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood directly before him. He lifted Seorian's chin with 2 fingers, cold, commanding. "I didn't buy a servant," Taeyeon said quietly. "I bought silence, obedience, a body that will not betray me." Seorian's throat tightened. "Yes, Your Majesty." Taeyeon's grip tightened just enough to hurt. "Do not lie to me," he warned. "Fear smells worse than deceit." He released him abruptly and turned to Seorian's father. "The debt is erased," Taeyeon said. "Your house survives." Relief shattered the man. He dropped to his knees. "My son will make you happy," he said desperately. "He will love you." That was when Taeyeon laughed. A low, humorless sound. "Love," the king repeated. "He doesn't need to love me." Taeyeon turned back to Seorian. "He needs to endure me." The wedding was performed before sunset. No celebration. No warmth. Only vows spoken by priests, while Taeyeon watched Seorian like a prize being weighed for flaws. When the ring slid onto Seorian's finger, Taeyeon leaned close. "You are a replacement," he murmured so softly, no one else could hear. "Do not forget that." Seorian's chest ached. "For whom?" he whispered. Taeyeon's eyes darkened. "Someone who failed me." That night, the palace became a cage. Taeyeon dismissed the servants and closed the chamber doors himself. The sound echoed final and absolute. "You will not leave these rooms without permission," the king said. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not give your attention to anyone but me." Seorian gathered his courage. "And if I fail?" Taeyeon stepped closer, gaze burning. "Then I will remind you who owns you." Silence stretched between them, dangerous, electric. Seorian lowered his head. "Yes, my king." Taeyeon watched him for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled Seorian, far more than anger ever could. Chapter 2. The King's Possession. Seorian learned the rules of the cage before he learned the palace. He learned them in silence. In the way servants avoided his eyes, in the way doors closed a little too quickly behind him, in the way every step he took was quietly reported to the king. You do not walk alone. You do not speak freely. You do not forget who you belong to. The rules were never written. They were enforced. The palace woke early, but Seorian woke earlier. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded tightly in his lap, staring at the mark the ring left on his finger. It was heavy, gold biting into skin like a promise he hadn't agreed to. The doors opened without warning. King Taeyeon entered as if the room existed only when he stepped into it. You're awake, the king said. Yes, your majesty. Taeyeon's gaze swept over him slowly, critically, lingering on Seoryeon's posture, his expression, the faint shadows beneath his eyes. You slept poorly. It was not a question. I'll do better, Seoryeon said quickly. Taeyeon stopped in front of him. You misunderstand, he said quietly. Your comfort is not a priority. Seoryeon flinched despite himself. But your obedience is. The day unfolded like a test Seoryeon didn't know he was taking. Servants dressed him carefully, too carefully, adjusting every fold of fabric as if perfection might protect him from punishment. Guards escorted him through corridors he was not allowed to memorize. When he paused too long at a window, watching the gardens below, a voice cut through the stillness. Enjoying the view? Taeyeon stood behind him. I was only looking for escape, the king finished calmly. Seoryeon shook his head immediately. Never. Taeyeon stepped closer, so close Seoryeon could feel his breath. Good, he said, because I would bring you back. By midday, Seoryeon understood the truth. The king was watching him. Not openly, not constantly, but always. A servant whispered something to Taeyeon across the hall, and the king's gaze snapped instantly to Seoryeon, sharp, assessing. What did you say to her? Taeyeon asked later. I thanked her for the tea, Seoryeon replied, confused. Taeyeon's eyes narrowed. You don't need to thank anyone. I was only being polite. You don't belong to them, Taeyeon interrupted. You belong to me. The words were quiet, possessive, final. That evening, Taeyeon brought him to the outer court. Nobles gathered in clusters, conversation flowing easily, until Seoryeon entered. Then came the whispers, the stares, the thinly veiled curiosity. This is my consort, Taeyeon announced coolly. A claim, a warning. Seoryeon stood beside him, heart racing, acutely aware of every gaze that lingered too long. One noble, a young general, looked openly intrigued. Too openly. Taeyeon noticed. His hand settled at Seoryeon's waist, not gentle, not affectionate. Territorial. The general bowed quickly and looked away. Seoryeon swallowed. Did you like that? Taeyeon asked softly as they walked away. What? The attention, the king said. Did you enjoy being looked at? No, Seoryeon said immediately. Taeyeon stopped walking. Do not lie, he said quietly. I will tolerate fear. I will not tolerate deceit. Seoryeon's voice trembled. I didn't enjoy it. I only noticed because you noticed. Something dangerous flickered in Taeyeon's eyes. Good answer, he said. That night, the king came to Seoryeon's chamber without summoning him. Seoryeon knelt instinctively. Stand, Taeyeon ordered. He circled Seoryeon slowly, like a predator assessing weakness. You will not seek comfort from others, Taeyeon said. You will not build alliances. You will not imagine escape. Seoryeon's breath shook. And if I obey? Taeyeon stopped in front of him, lifted his chin with 2 fingers. Then I will keep you, the king said. Safe, untouched, mine. Seoryeon's chest tightened painfully. And if I don't, he whispered. Taeyeon leaned closer, voice a breath from his ear. Then I will remind you, he said, that even silence can scream. When Taeyeon finally left, Seoryeon sank onto the bed, trembling. This was not love. This was not kindness. This was possession, slow, deliberate, suffocating. And the most terrifying part? When the king's footsteps faded down the corridor, Seoryeon realized his heart ached, not with relief, but with longing. Good, the king said, because once you belong to me, I do not share. Chapter 2. the king's possession. Seorian learned the rules of the cage before he learned the palace. He learned them in silence, in the way servants avoided his eyes, in the way doors closed a little too quickly behind him, in the way every step he took was quietly reported to the king. You do not walk alone. You do not speak freely. You do not forget who you belong to. The rules were never written. They were enforced. The palace woke early, but Seorian woke earlier. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded tightly in his lap, staring at the mark the ring left on his finger. It was heavy, gold biting into skin like a promise he hadn't agreed to. The doors opened without warning. King Taehyun entered as if the room existed only when he stepped into it. "You're awake," the king said. "Yes, your majesty." Taehyun's gaze swept over him slowly, critically, lingering on Seorian's posture, his expression, the faint shadows beneath his eyes. "You slept poorly." It was not a question. "I'll do better," Seorian said quickly. Taehyun stopped in front of him. "You misunderstand," he said quietly. "Your comfort is not a priority." Seorian flinched despite himself. "But your obedience is." The day unfolded like a test Seorian didn't know he was taking. Servants dressed him carefully, too carefully, adjusting every fold of fabric as if perfection might protect him from punishment. Guards escorted him through corridors he was not allowed to memorize. When he paused too long at a window, watching the gardens below, a voice cut through the stillness. "Enjoying the view?" Taehyun stood behind him. "I was only looking for escape," the king finished calmly. Seorian shook his head immediately. "Never." Taehyun stepped closer, so close Seorian could feel his breath. "Good," he said, "because I would bring you back." By midday, Seorian understood the truth. The king was watching him. Not openly, not constantly, but always. A servant whispered something to Taehyun across the hall, and the king's gaze snapped instantly to Seorian, sharp, assessing. "What did you say to her?" Taehyun asked later. "I thanked her for the tea," Seorian replied, confused. Taehyun's eyes narrowed. "You don't need to thank anyone. I was only being polite." "You don't belong to them," Taehyun interrupted. "You belong to me." The words were quiet, possessive, final. Dolkanyi. That evening, Taehyun brought him to the outer court. Nobles gathered in clusters, conversation flowing easily, until Seorian entered. Then came the whispers, the stares, the thinly veiled curiosity. "This is my consort," Taehyun announced coolly. A claim, a warning. Seorian stood beside him, heart racing, acutely aware of every gaze that lingered too long. One noble, a young general, looked openly intrigued. Too openly. Taehyun noticed. His hand settled at Seorian's waist, not gentle, not affectionate, territorial. The general bowed quickly and looked away. Seorian swallowed. "Did you like that?" Taehyun asked softly, as they walked away. What?" "The attention," the king said. "Did you enjoy being looked at?" "No," Seorian said immediately. Taehyun stopped walking. "Do not lie," he said quietly. "I will tolerate fear. I will not tolerate deceit." Seorian's voice trembled. "I didn't enjoy it. I only noticed because you noticed." Something dangerous flickered in Taehyun's eyes. "Good answer," he said. That night, the king came to Seorian's chamber without summoning him. Seorian knelt instinctively. "Stand," Taehyun ordered. He circled Seorian slowly, like a predator assessing weakness. "You will not seek comfort from others," Taehyun said. "You will not build alliances. You will not imagine escape." Seorian's breath shook. "And if I obey?" Taehyun stopped in front of him, lifted his chin with 2 fingers. "Then I will keep you," the king said. Safe, untouched, mine. Sayorian's chest tightened painfully. And if I don't? He whispered. Taehyun leaned closer, voice a breath from his ear. Then I will remind you, he said, that even silence can scream. When Taehyun finally left, Sayorian sank onto the bed, trembling. This was not love. This was not kindness. This was possession, slow, deliberate, suffocating. And the most terrifying part? When the king's footsteps faded down the corridor, Sayorian realized his heart ached, not with relief, but with longing. Chapter 3. The First Night. Night fell like a verdict. The chamber was lit only by a single brazier, its flames low and restless. Sayun stood near the bed, hands clenched in the fabric of his robes, every breath tight in his chest. He had been prepared, dressed, scented, arranged like an offering placed where it was meant to be taken. The door closed. King Taeyeon did not speak at first. He removed his outer robe with deliberate calm, movements precise, controlled. The sound of fabric sliding free felt unbearably loud in the quiet. When he turned, his gaze fixed on Seorion with an intensity that made Seorion's pulse stutter. "Kneel," Taeyeon said. Seorion obeyed. The stone was cold beneath his knees. He lowered his head, waiting for instructions that did not come. Silence stretched, heavy and punishing. "You're afraid," the king said at last. "Yes," Seorion whispered. There was no point lying. Taehyun stepped closer. Seorion felt him before he saw him, the heat of his presence, the shadow falling over him. "Fear makes you honest," Taehyun said. "That's why I don't take it from you." Seorion's breath shook. "You understand what tonight is," the king continued. "You understand what the crown requires?" "Yes, your majesty." Taehyun's hand came to Seorion's chin, tilting his face upward. Their eyes met, Seorion's wide and wet with dread, Taehyun's dark and unreadable. "Look at me," Taehyun said. "Do not disappear." The command landed harder than any threat. What followed was inevitable. Not rushed. Not tender. Inevitable. Taehyun's authority filled the space completely, unyielding, absolute. Seorion did not resist. He could not. The choice had been taken from him long before the door closed. He focused on breathing, on staying present, on not breaking beneath the weight of it. When it was over, the silence felt different, sharper. Seorion lay still, staring at the ceiling, chest rising and falling too fast. His body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else now. Taehyun stood apart from him, already pulling his composure back into place like armor. "This does not make us equal," the king said quietly. "Do not mistake consummation for closeness." Seorion swallowed. "I won't." Taehyun hesitated, just for a fraction of a heartbeat, long enough to betray something uncertain. Then he turned away. Sleep did not come. Seorion lay awake long after the brazier burned low, listening to the king's steady breathing on the far side of the bed. There was distance between them, measured, intentional. Ownership without comfort. Power without mercy. At some point, Seorion's control slipped. A tear traced quietly into his hair, quickly wiped away. He refused to make a sound. Beside him, Taehyun did not move. But he did not sleep either. Morning arrived pale and unforgiving. Seorion dressed himself slowly, hands unsteady. When he turned, Taehyun was already watching him. "You will remain within the inner wing today," the king said. "No visitors." "Yes, your majesty." Taehyun paused at the door. "You endured," he said, not looking at him. "That is sufficient." The door closed. Seorion sat down hard on the edge of the bed, fingers curling into the sheets. This was the truth of his marriage. Not passion. Not affection. Endurance, and somewhere, deep beneath the fear and the hurt, a dangerous thought took root. If endurance was all the king demanded, then Seorian would survive long enough to be remembered. Chapter 4. Punishment. Punishment did not come immediately. That was how King Taehyun wielded it. Slowly, precisely, allowing anticipation to do the damage first. Seorian waited. The morning after the first night passed in eerie quiet. No summons. No reprimands. No sign that anything had changed, except that everything had. Servants avoided Seorian's eyes, even more than before. His meals arrived untouched by conversation, placed down and withdrawn from like offerings left for a spirit no one wished to anger. When he stepped into the corridor, guards followed at a distance. Not protection, surveillance. By afternoon, the silence became unbearable. The punishment arrived at court. Taehyun ordered Seorian to attend the afternoon assembly, his first appearance since the marriage was consummated. He was dressed deliberately in pale robes, fabric too thin, color too honest. Every mark of vulnerability visible. "Stand there," Taehyun instructed, pointing not beside the throne, but below it. Seorian obeyed. The nobles noticed immediately. Whispers bloomed. The Omega stood exposed, head bowed, while Taehyun sat above him in cold authority. Every gaze cut into Seorian's skin, stripping him layer by layer. "This is my consort," Taehyun announced calmly. "Observe him." The words were not praise. They were permission. A noble laughed softly. Another whispered something sharp enough to sting. Someone commented on Seorian's posture, his fragility, the way he trembled. Seorian said nothing. He endured. That was what Taehyun had taught him. Then Yongjin stepped forward. "I didn't realize you planned to display him," Yongjin said lightly. "Is this correction or entertainment?" A ripple of tension passed through the hall. Taehyun's gaze flicked to Seorian, not with concern, but expectation. "Speak," the king commanded. Seorian's heart slammed painfully against his ribs. "I don't understand, Your Majesty." "You allowed him to look at you," Taehyun said coolly. "Explain." Yongjin smiled. "I only admired what you bought." That was when the hall went silent. Taehyun rose slowly, but his anger did not turn toward Yongjin. It turned toward Seorian. "You mistake stillness for innocence," Taehyun said, voice dangerously calm. "You invited attention." "I didn't," Seorian whispered, panic creeping in. "I swear." "Intent does not matter," Taehyun replied. "Impact does." He turned to the court. "You may leave." When the doors closed, the punishment became private. "You embarrassed me," Taehyun said. Seorian knelt immediately. "I never meant to." "You never mean to," Taehyun interrupted. "And yet, men look at you like you are something to take." Seorian's breath shook. "I belong to you." Taehyun's eyes darkened dangerously. "Say it again." "I belong to you," Seorian repeated, voice breaking. Taehyun stepped closer, towering over him. "Then why do you make me jealous?" The word landed like a blade. "Jealous." Taehyun noticed it too, how others looked, how Seorian drew attention without trying. And the realization disgusted him almost as much as it frightened him. "You will stay in your chambers," Taehyun said. "You will not appear at court unless I permit it." Seorian bowed lower. "Yes, my king." "And you will learn," Taehyun added, fingers tightening briefly in Seorian's hair, "that my patience is not mercy." The days that followed were isolation sharpened into cruelty. Seorian was forbidden from the gardens, forbidden from visitors, forbidden from asking questions. Taehyun visited nightly, but never touched him. He stood in the shadows, watching Seorian eat, watching him sleep, watching him break slowly beneath the weight of being seen but never comforted. You exist because I allow it, Taehyun said one night. Seorian nodded silently. And yet, the king continued, voice low, if anyone harms you, I will destroy them. The contradiction was maddening. Punishment and protection tangled so tightly, Seorian could no longer tell them apart. One evening, exhaustion betrayed him. Seorian collapsed while walking back to his chambers, vision swimming, knees giving out. Strong hands caught him before he hit the floor. Taehyun thought so. The king stared down at him. At the hollow cheeks, the trembling breath, the exhaustion etched too deeply for punishment alone. Why didn't you call for help? Taehyun demanded. Seorian's voice was barely there. I didn't know if I was allowed. Something inside Taehyun cracked. He carried Seorian back himself. That night, Taehyun did not leave. And for the first time since the punishment began, the king sat beside the bed. Not as ruler, not as judge, but as something far more dangerous. A man realizing he might destroy what he refuses to let go. Chapter 5. The Air. The body always speaks before the heart is ready to listen. Seorian learned this the morning he collapsed. It happened quietly. No dramatic cry. No warning. He had just finished dressing when the room tilted, the edges of his vision blurring. His fingers brushed the table, searching for balance that never came. The floor rushed up to meet him. Darkness followed. When Seorian woke, the air smelled sharply of herbs and smoke. His head throbbed. His limbs felt heavy, distant, as though they belonged to someone else. Soft voices murmured nearby, healers, and one presence that silenced them all. King Taehyun, Doto. You're awake, the king said. Seorian tried to sit up. I failed. Do not move, Taehyun ordered, sharper than intended. The healer bowed low. Your Majesty, the consort's body is under severe strain. Taehyun's jaw tightened. From what? The healer hesitated, then spoke. He is with child. The words dropped into the room like a blade. Silence. Absolute. Taehyun did not move, did not speak. His face betrayed nothing, but something dark and violent shifted behind his eyes. A child, the king repeated. Yes, your Majesty, an heir. Seorian's breath stuttered. His hand moved instinctively to his stomach, fingers trembling. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear. The healer bowed again. The consort's stress, isolation, and treatment have endangered both Omega and child. Continued punishment may cost you the heir. Punishment. The word echoed too loudly. Leave us, Taehyun said. The healers fled. When the doors closed, the air became unbearable. Seorian braced himself, heart pounding. If you are angry, I'm not, Taehyun said. That frightened Seorian far more. The king stood slowly, approaching the bed. His gaze dropped, not to Seorian's face, but to his stomach. My heir, Taehyun said quietly. Possessive, reverent, terrified. You were hurting, Seorian whispered. Because of me. Taehyun's eyes snapped to his. Because of me. The admission was raw, dangerous. I punished you, Taehyun continued, and I nearly destroyed what belongs to the crown. Seorian swallowed. Do you want the child? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Taehyun answered without hesitation. I will protect what is mine. Not love. Protection. Obsession. From that day forward, the palace changed. Orders were issued swiftly and without explanation. Seorian was confined, not as punishment, but as preservation. Servants were replaced with ones Taehyun trusted. guards doubled. Food monitored. Air scented carefully. Taeyeon visited constantly. Sometimes to speak. Sometimes only to watch. He studied Seoryeon's breathing. His appetite. The way he slept curled protectively around his stomach. "You will wait," Taeyeon commanded one night, placing a bowl in Seoryeon's hands himself. "I'm not hungry." "You will eat," Taeyeon repeated, voice steel-edged. "My heir will not starve." Seoryeon obeyed, trembling. Yongjin noticed. "Of course he did. You're hiding him," Yongjin accused one evening. "Like a treasure you're afraid to lose." Taeyeon's response was immediate. "You will not speak his name again." Yongjin laughed bitterly. "So it's true. He's pregnant." Taeyeon's eyes went dark. "Leave, before I forget what you once were." Yongjin left the palace that night. He would not forgive. Later, as Seoryeon lay half asleep, Taeyeon sat beside the bed. "You're afraid," Seoryeon murmured. Taeyeon's hand hovered, then rested carefully over Seoryeon's stomach. "Yes," the king admitted. "I am." Seoryeon opened his eyes. "Of losing power?" Taeyeon shook his head once. "Of losing you." The words hung between them, unwanted, undeniable. Seoryeon's heart clenched painfully. That night, for the first time since the marriage, Taeyeon did not sleep on the far side of the bed. He remained close, guarding, watching, possessing. And Seoryeon understood something terrifying. The crown no longer bound him here. The child did. And the king, who once punished him for being seen, was now willing to burn the world to keep him breathing. Chapter 6. The Feast. The midwinter feast was an event of tradition. But this time, it would be different. The grand hall of Hwarin Palace gleamed with light, every surface draped in red and gold. The nobles of the court gathered in their finest, jewels, silks, and whispers, all veiled behind masks of civility. The scent of roasting meats, spiced wine, and incense hung heavy in the air. And yet, despite the celebration, a tension simmered beneath the surface. The king had never been one to show weakness in public. But tonight he would show them just how far he would go to claim what was his. Seoryeon stood at the back of the hall, his hands trembling as he adjusted the heavy fabric of his ceremonial robe. The servants had done their best, but every piece of clothing seemed designed to expose him, to remind him of what he was, what he had become. A consort, an omega, a possession. A child stirred uneasily within him, the first signs of life that were both a blessing and a chain. Taeyeon was already at the high table, surrounded by his closest allies, his eyes cold and calculating. The nobles whispered amongst themselves, their eyes flicking toward the king, then toward Seoryeon. The looks were not kind, nor curious. They were possessive. They wanted what they could not have. Seoryeon could feel the eyes on him, but he did not move, not until the king's voice called out. "Consort Seoryeon," Taeyeon said, his tone smooth, almost casual, though Seoryeon heard the sharp edge beneath it. "Come, come." The room fell silent. Seoryeon crossed the marble floor, his every step calculated. The moment he arrived at the high table, the gaze of every noble in the room followed him. Seoryeon's heart pounded painfully in his chest. The king stood and extended a hand to him. The way his fingers curled around Seoryeon's wrist made the air between them crackle with a possessive force. It was not a gesture of love. Not yet. Not truly. But it was a claim. Seoryeon lowered his head and placed his hand in the king's, letting Taeyeon pull him closer with an almost painful grip. "Sit," Taeyeon commanded, not even looking at him. "Here." Seoryeon sat beside the king, his heart hammering as the weight of everyone's gaze pressed down on him. The feast began with ceremony, but for Seoryeon, The night stretched into something darker. The noble spoke freely, drinking, laughing, but every glance, every word felt like a weapon aimed at Seorian. He felt the eyes on him, evaluating, dissecting, judging. It was no longer just the king who claimed him. It was the entire court. Taehan's hand never left Seorian's thigh, his fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of Seorian's robes as a subtle reminder. Mine. The claim was unmistakable. But then, the whispering began. Did you see how they look at him? A consort? To the king? What a display! Does the king truly need him? A voice rang out from across the hall. Yongjin. Zairian's heart skipped a beat. The former lover had returned. Taeyeon's expression didn't change, but Seorian could feel the tension in the king's body as Yongjin stood from his seat at a distant table and made his way over to them. Your Majesty, Yongjin said, his voice smooth, laced with the familiarity of a man who once knew the king too well. I must admit, the sight of you and your consort. Taeyeon's eyes flicked to Yongjin, but he said nothing. Yongjin turned his gaze on Seorian, a smirk playing at his lips. Seorian, is it? Yongjin's voice was like silk, too smooth, too calculated. You look, well, perhaps a little small for the king's tastes. Seorian felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, but he kept his head lowered, staying silent. Taeyeon's fingers dug into Seorian's thigh, a silent command that Seorian did not need to question. Yongjin's smirk faltered under the pressure of Taeyeon's gaze. You will not speak to him again, the king said, his voice low, dangerous. The command in his voice was enough to silence the entire room. Yongjin's eyes darkened. You choose him. Taeyeon did not hesitate. I already have. The tension crackled between them. Yongjin, the former lover, who had once thought himself the king's chosen, and Seorian, the Omega who had been bought and claimed for a price. But in this moment, it was not Yongjin who held Taeyeon's attention. It was Seorian. The king's possessiveness was palpable, suffocating, and the room could feel it. Every noble watching, every gaze lingering, could feel the heat of Taeyeon's obsession burning at the edges of the court. Taeyeon stood suddenly, his hand on Seorian's wrist, pulling him up beside him. The king's voice rang out, loud and clear, to the entire hall. Do not mistake my patience for weakness, Taeyeon declared. I do not share. His words were not a warning. They were a promise. When the feast finally ended, Seorian found himself alone in the king's chamber. Taeyeon's gaze was sharp, dark with something searing beneath the surface, something not quite love, not quite hatred. Seorian stood before him, feeling the weight of the king's attention, like a heavy chain wrapping around his chest. You thought you could be seen by others, Taeyeon said, his voice dark. You thought you could be admired. I didn't. Seorian started, but his voice faltered. Taeyeon stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You belong to me, the king said quietly. And only to me. Seorian's chest tightened as he looked up at Taeyeon. Do you understand? Seorian nodded. Yes, your majesty. Taeyeon's lips curled slightly. Good, because from now on you will only exist for me. And anyone who dares to look at you will learn that the cost of looking too long is far higher than they expect. That night, Seorian lay in bed, the weight of the king's words hanging in the air. The king was not cruel. He was not kind. He was possessive. And Seorian was bound to him. By choice? By force? He no longer knew. But one thing was certain. He would never be allowed to escape. Chapter 7. Taken. Seorian woke to an empty bed. The cool morning light filtered through the windows, casting pale shadows across the room. His limbs felt heavy, as though they were still trapped in the dreams from the night before, haunted by the echoes of Taeyeon's possessive touch. But this morning, The absence of the king beside him was far more suffocating than the oppressive silence that filled the room. Taehyun had not come to him last night. Seorian lay there for a long time, watching the light shift across the marble floors, feeling the weight of the king's absence pressing on him more than his presence ever had. The emptiness that followed Taehyun's departure from the bed was something he couldn't escape. He could feel it, the absence of control. Taehyun was watching. Always. By mid-morning, the palace had fallen into its usual routine of whispers and murmurs. Servants moved silently, their gazes darting when Seorian crossed their path. He was nothing more than an object to be managed, a possession to be kept in line. But something was different today. The tension in the air was palpable, heavier than usual. It was as if everyone in the palace could sense the shift, the crack in the facade that held everything together. It was the look in Taehyun's eyes when he returned to the palace that evening. The grand doors opened, and the king's silhouette darkened the entrance. Seorian had been standing by the window, lost in thought, when he heard the unmistakable sound of Taehyun's boots against the stone floor. His body tensed before he even turned around, heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't the king's approach that unnerved him, it was the sense that Taehyun was walking toward something that had already been decided. His fate. Their fate. The air crackled with something electric, something dangerous. "Come here," Taehyun commanded, his voice low but demanding, the force of his presence filling the space between them. Seorian obeyed, every instinct screaming at him to remain silent, to comply, to endure. When he reached the king, Taehyun's eyes locked onto him with a dark intensity. The king didn't need to say a word. The possessiveness in his gaze spoke volumes. "You look untouched," Taehyun said, his words like a challenge, though he wasn't looking for an answer. Seorian opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't lie. He couldn't deny the fact that, despite the coldness that had settled between them in the past few days, he still wanted him. Needed him in ways he had never imagined. "Do you know what happens when I'm ignored?" Taehyun's voice lowered, sharp and dangerous, as he stepped closer to Seorian. Seorian's pulse quickened. He had seen this look before, the dangerous edge of the king's desire, the one that demanded obedience and punished disobedience. Seorian tried to speak, but the words didn't form. Instead, he stood there, frozen, a part of him longing to speak his mind but knowing that the price for that freedom would be far too high. Taehyun's hand reached out, gripping Seorian's wrist with a possessive force that made his breath catch in his throat. He pulled Seorian closer, the pressure in the room tightening like a noose around his neck. "I don't share," Taehyun said in a low growl. "And I don't forgive." Before Seorian could process what was happening, Taehyun's mouth was on his, hard and demanding. It wasn't a kiss, it was a claim. A reminder of who owned who, of who controlled the power between them. Taehyun kissed him as if he were starving, as if Seorian was the only thing that could fill the emptiness inside him. The king's hands roamed over his body, pulling him closer, as if trying to absorb every inch of him. Seorian gasped against the kiss, but Taehyun didn't let him go. His hand gripped Seorian's jaw, holding him in place, as if reminding him that he belonged to the king, body, mind, and soul. "I warned you," Taehyun muttered against Seorian's lips. "You won't escape me, not now, not ever." The night was long and endless, like a punishment wrapped in the guise of intimacy. Taehyun didn't know when the boundaries between pain and pleasure blurred, but by the time it ended he was left lying in the cold emptiness of the room, Taehyun's weight still heavy on his chest. His body ached from the king's touch, each mark left behind a reminder of the price he paid for this marriage. And yet, even as the king pulled away, leaving him alone in the dark, Seorian's heart twisted painfully. Not because of the pain, not because of the punishment, but because he still wanted more. In the days that followed, Seorian became more and more a prisoner of the king's obsession. Taeyeon watched him constantly, tracking his every move, controlling every conversation, every glance, every breath he took. Taeyeon knew what Soria needed before he did. Taeyeon knew how to break him. And yet, Seorian still stayed. By the time Seorian had recovered enough to walk the halls of the palace once again, he realized just how much control Taeyeon had over him. It was suffocating, inescapable. But the terrifying part was that Seorian was beginning to crave the control, to long for it in ways that made him sick to his core. Taeyeon's possessiveness was a constant, a weight pressing down on him like a stone. And Seorian was starting to wonder if he could ever break free, or if, in the end, he even wanted to. Seorian's fears became a reality when the next rival arrived at court, someone from the outer provinces, a noble eager to impress the king. His eyes lingered on Seorian too long. He admired him with far too much interest. Seorian could feel it. Taeyeon was watching. Taeyeon's gaze never left the two of them as they spoke. And when Seorian excused himself, the king's presence followed him like a shadow. That night, Seorian was not alone. Taeyeon's jealousy, once barely contained, snapped. "You belong to me," Taeyeon said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I will remind you every night why that is." Chapter 8. Forever Bound. The kingdom of Hwarin had always been a place where power was everything, where loyalty was bought with gold, and where the king's word was law. But now, Seorian realized there was more to it, something far darker. Something that bound him to King Taeyeon with invisible chain. Seorian had never been alone, not since the day he had been sold to the king. In the palace, his life was suffocatingly controlled, every step, every breath, watched by the ever-present eyes of the guards. Taeyeon's eyes, however, were different. They weren't just watching him. They were measuring him, testing him, claiming him in ways Seorian couldn't understand. Days blurred together. Taeyeon's attention was a constant weight, always close, never letting him breathe without the king's presence in his thoughts. Seorian had been made into the king's consort, his omega, his possession. He could feel it every moment. He could feel it in the way Taeyeon spoke to him, the way he touched him. It was more than just ownership. It was domination, obsession, a consuming desire to break him, to possess him entirely. Taeyeon's jealousy simmered beneath the surface, never far from boiling over. He would watch Seorian when other men looked at him too long, when a noble dared to speak to him with too much familiarity. His eyes would darken, his posture would stiffen, and a coldness would settle in his features that made everyone, even Seorian, instinctively back away. The king had made it clear, Seorian belonged to him. That night, the final strings of control snapped. Taeyeon had summoned Seorian to his chambers. He was waiting when Seorian entered, his back to the door, eyes sharp as he turned toward him. "You look beautiful tonight," Taeyeon said, voice low, dangerous. Seorian flinched but held his ground. He didn't respond, though his heart was racing. Taeyeon stepped toward him, his movements slow, deliberate. "You don't need to speak, you just need to obey." Seorian's pulse quickened. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king closed the distance between them, a dark, possessive hunger in his gaze. His hand gripped Seorian's chin, forcing his head back, exposing his throat. "Do you know why you're mine?" Seorian's breath caught in his throat. "Because I was sold to you." Taeyeon's grip tightened, the words slipping from his lips like a dangerous promise. "Because you belong to me, and no one will ever take you from me." The king leaned in, his lips brushing against Seorian's ear. "Not your body, not your heart, not your soul, you are mine in every way." Tears burned in Seorian's eyes, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. His heart twisted, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if it was fear or desire he was feeling. Taeyeon's lips moved to Seorian's neck, kissing the skin with a possessive fierceness that made Seorian's breath hitch. You will bear my child, Taehyun whispered. You will carry my heir, and nothing, not even your pain, will stop me from making you mine. Seoryun didn't respond. He couldn't. His heart was too full of confusion, of fear, of longing. Was he just a pawn in the king's game? Or had something deeper, something darker, been growing between them all along? The days passed in a haze of possessiveness. Taehyun's control grew stronger. He watched Seoryun with obsessive intensity, tracking every movement, every word, every breath. Every night he claimed Seoryun again and again, not out of love, but because he could. Because Seoryun was his. And with each passing day, Seoryun's resistance crumbled. The king had broken him, body, mind, and soul, and now he was bound to him in a way that felt impossible to escape. But something was changing. Seoryun could feel it even if he couldn't name it. The king was no longer just the man who owned him. He was something more. Something dangerous. Something that had seeped into Seoryun's heart when he wasn't looking. Taehyun had taken him, but he had also protected him. And for the first time since their marriage, Seoryun wondered if there was more to this twisted bond than he had thought. That night, Seoryun lay awake, the king's arms around him, the warmth of his body pressing against Seoryun's back. I'll never let anyone take you from me, Taehyun murmured, his voice low, possessive. Seoryun closed his eyes. Could he ever be free of this? But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew the truth. The answer had already been decided the moment he was bought. He was already bound. And in a way that terrified him, Seoryun realized he didn't want to escape. Taehyun had broken him. Taehyun had possessed him. And now, Seoryun had chosen to stay. Forever bound. The end.